The impeachment vote for the U.S. president took place at midnight Korean time. The Golden Gate Korean branch was brightly lit throughout the entire building. Most employees had given up going home and remained at the office, all anxiously watching the TV. Other financial companies likely shared a similar atmosphere. As the plummeting U.S. stock market received news that the impeachment articles had passed the House by an overwhelming margin, it attempted a rebound. There were hopes that Ronald's resignation would resolve the uncertainty. Hyunju also came out of the branch manager's office to watch the TV with the staff. Ellie asked Hyunju with a look of panic, "So what will happen to Jin-Hoo now?" Hyunju extinguished the cigarette she was smoking and replied, "It's over." She had opposed this from the beginning. Yet her inability to dissuade them stemmed from the firmness of their intentions. Unlike the Brexit situation where everything was a gamble, she thought experiencing failure this time might not be so bad. However, as time went on, the situation escalated uncontrollably. The OTK company shares were frozen, the U.S. president was moved to declare an emergency measure, and ultimately, an unprecedented impeachment of the president unfolded. At this point, losing money wasn't the issue. The concern was whether they could return safely to Korea. Ellie exclaimed urgently, "We need to go to the U.S. right now." Hyunju nodded. "That's the best course of action. Let's head to the airport immediately." If they couldn't secure plane tickets, she was considering reaching out to Seosong Electronics to rent a private jet. However, the resignation announcement couldn't be completed. Gasp. "Oh my gosh. Things are getting ridiculous." The TV screen displayed images of a collapsed city. Could that really be San Francisco? In the Korean branch there were several Americans working. Those who witnessed the tragedy happening in their homeland were so shocked that they sank to the ground or burst into tears. Everyone was too stunned to say a word. After a moment, Ellie with tear-filled eyes said, "Jin-Hoo was right. The big one really came." Hyunju braced herself on the desk with both hands to avoid collapsing. "I really can't live because of these kids." Unlike most financial firms, Golden Gate had bet on the big one. They would likely make enormous profits. Watching the devastated city, she didn't know whether to feel happy or sad. But regardless, she decided to take comfort in the fact that her brother was safe. OTK Company's headquarters also had more than half of its employees delayed in leaving, watching the TV in the office. Kang Jin, who had been hoarding raw materials in the market for months. However, he repeatedly stated that the purpose of acquiring these materials was for disaster recovery, not for making money. That said, he didn't truly have no intention of making money. He had accurately predicted the disaster and informed everyone about it. How could he not profit from that? Wow. The employees who had been cheering changed their expressions when they saw Henry and Michael Lee. What must the Americans be feeling right now? Setting that aside, being pleased by such a disaster is not what it means to be human. Park Sang-yeep mumbled in disbelief. "I can't believe he actually got it right." Kang Jin, who had gained fame by predicting various crisis situations. But upon reflection, Brexit and Ronald's election were just unexpected events on the scheduled voting days. There were a number of experts who predicted those, though few made money from that investment. However, earthquakes were different. This was not just a question of whether the big one would come, but rather when it would arrive. Of course, Park Sang-yeep thought it was unlikely that Kang Jin-Hoo would make a wrong choice, but it was unreasonable to have complete confidence based solely on Professor Mohan's words. "I can't shake the feeling that Professor might be a fraud." In any case, given the instructions to bet on the big one, Park Sang-yeep acted as directed. Up until this point he hadn't been overly proactive. However, the story changed after Kang Jin-Hoo deposited his shares with the state government of California. If the big one came, there would be a significant profit and the share deposit would be voided. Conversely, if the big one did not come, there would be considerable losses, but the shares would transfer to the California state government. In other words, profits belonged to the company, while losses were the state government's responsibility. With the situation being like this, Park Sang-yeep could invest the company's money in risky products without any burden. He leveraged the situation to buy put options while simultaneously purchasing dollars and yen in the foreign exchange market and selling emerging market currencies. The time mentioned by Kang Jin-Hoo was until the end of September, and now only a few days remain until that date. Everyone thought he was wrong. But today that event finally happened. Immediately, the entire American stock market, including the US, was shocked and staggered. In contrast, gold, oil, and raw materials soared, and the $1 exchange rate quickly surpassed 1,401. As the day breaks, Asian markets will begin to plummet one after another. Stock investors will struggle to sleep tonight. The exact profit will only be known after liquidating positions, but it will certainly exceed $10 billion. This amount will not only cover the expenses incurred while preparing for Big One but also leave a surplus. While money is important, Park Sang-yeop thought of something else. The events of the past month flashed through his mind. Daily protests by conservative groups in front of the company, misleading articles written by irresponsible journalists, media manipulation and fabrication, police merely watching with arms crossed, raids by prosecutors, assaults and controversies, and so on. Such events couldn't have happened without a reason. There was surely a hidden agenda, and he had his suspicions about who was behind it. It must be revenge for the Hozong Savings Bank incident. It's not hard to understand that sentiment. They probably thought Kang Jin-woo would collapse, but the results turned out to be the exact opposite. Now Kang Jin-woo has become a hero who saved the US from crisis. Park Sang-yeop untied the bandage from his head and shouted, "The counterattack begins, you bastards." The risk of Big One emerged 2 months ago. The reason is, of course, aftershock awareness. Since then, the federal government and the California state government have been preparing for earthquakes. The importance of prompt response in disasters cannot be overstated. The success of rescue operations depends on how many personnel are deployed efficiently in the early stages of a disaster. Whether military or fire departments, intense rescue training was conducted for a while. Until then, many thought it was a crazy idea. People grumbled that they were undergoing unnecessary training because of the aftershocks in Ronald. But when the event actually occurred, the narrative changed. California military base. Helicopters were secured to avoid collisions. Therefore, despite a significant shock passing through, there were hardly any damaged helicopters. Colonel Lucas shouted to his subordinates, "The military exists for the people. Our mission is to save as many lives as possible." Understood. The subordinates responded in unison. Understood. At this moment, all helicopters were fully fueled and equipped with rescue gear. As soon as the dispatch order was given, dozens of helicopters took off in succession from the military base. A similar situation unfolded at the fire station. The San Francisco Bay Area was declared an emergency disaster zone, and flammable materials were removed from gas stations and storage tanks were emptied. Thanks to this, a large-scale explosion did not occur, but power lines were cut, gas pipelines were destroyed, and fires broke out everywhere. Fires make escape and rescue even more difficult. Both rescue helicopters and fire helicopters immediately deployed. The military and rescue teams launched operations centered around the danger zones. The relatively less affected outskirts inevitably faced a shortage of rescue personnel. Civilian rescue teams were deployed here. Big One shook all of California. The disaster broadcasts that played at all times proved to be a great help in situations like this. Mario quickly took his family into the shelter in their mansion, waiting for the aftershocks to pass. At that moment, a crackling sound accompanied by a transmission came through. "CK 4875. If you can hear me, respond." Mario immediately picked up the radio and responded. "CK 4875. I'm listening. Please depart immediately for rescue. Is it possible?" Mario looked at his trembling family. They shook their heads, indicating he shouldn't go. He recalled what the young staff member who set up the GPS and radio had said. "If anything happens, your helicopter will be a great help to someone." Right now, that someone could be desperately waiting for his assistance. Mario spoke into the radio. "Of course. I will depart immediately. I will send the location of the survivors via GPS." Understood. Mario got on the helicopter. The GPS installed by the staff displayed the location. His grandson, cradled in his mother's arms, watched his grandfather board the helicopter with wide eyes. "Where are you going, Grandpa?" Mario gave a thumbs up towards his grandson. "I'm going to save people and come back, Diego." Silicon Valley, Palo Alto. Despite the government's evacuation plan, most citizens remained in the city. With their homes and livelihoods established there, leaving wasn't easy. Moreover, most experts and politicians continued to deny the possibility of a major disaster, which provided some reassurance. Just 10 days ago, the headquarters and research labs of numerous IT companies here were operating vigorously. However, due to the government's oppressive measures, businesses were forced into indefinite shutdowns, and those with nothing to do gathered in pubs inside high-rise buildings to drink during the day. 2 photos were taped to the dartboard. They were of Ronald and Kang Jin-hoo. People threw darts at the pictures as a game. The photos were riddled with countless holes. On the large TV mounted on the wall, Ronald's resignation announcement was playing. Who voted that guy as president? Listening to Kang Jin-hoo's words has led to this. Everyone laughed joyfully while drinking. Beep beep beep. But at that moment, notifications rang out simultaneously from everyone's smartphones. Massive earthquake reported off the coast south of San Francisco. Residents in the area are advised to evacuate immediately. What's going on? Could it be? At first, everyone thought it was a joke. But in that moment, boom, a violent shock shook the building. Ah. The windows shattered simultaneously as if hit by a bomb. The lights hanging from the ceiling fell down over their heads. People covered their heads with their hands and crawled under the tables. The building continued to shake violently in all directions. Just before the TV screen went dark, the anchor's urgent voice came through. The big one has hit. Everyone run. The white man who had just been throwing darts at Kang Jin-hoo's face burst into tears. Damn it. Kang Jin-hoo was right. Others felt the same way. Why didn't we listen to him? Who the hell said the big one wasn't coming? How long had it been? Finally, the vibrations stopped. Is it all over? Are we alive? Oh God. Thank you. They tried to get up to exit the building. However, the elevator had stopped working and the staircase had collapsed. At that moment, the building shook violently again. It's an aftershock. The earthquake wasn't over yet. The building was leaning slightly to the side. At this rate, it wouldn't be long before it completely collapsed. Someone shouted, "Let's go to the rooftop." Most buildings keep the rooftop doors locked to prevent accidents. However, after being designated as an emergency disaster area, it became mandatory to keep them open for evacuation. They ran up the stairs. As they reached the rooftop, a shocking scene unfolded before them. The high-rise buildings that adorned the skyline of the city had collapsed. The roads were split open like crevasses and people and vehicles alike were sucked into the ground. Is this really the appearance of Palo Alto? People collapsed to the ground in despair. This must be a dream. How could this happen? We should have evacuated earlier. I don't want to die like this. Please help me. We're all going to die. Suddenly, it felt as if the sky was darkening. As everyone fell into despair, a young woman shouted, "That's not true. Look over there." She pointed to the sky and the people turned their heads in unison. Countless helicopters were flying, seemingly blocking out the sun. The U.S. government began serious operations after the Mexico City earthquake on September 19th. Due to the limited time available, less than 30% of residents in the highest risk area, classified as A1, were evacuated. Fortunately, tourist traffic had already ceased, and many people had voluntarily left the city. However, millions of people still remained there. Big One even shook the sea. The surging water column reached a height of 110 meters and traveled at a speed of 1,200 kilometers per hour. The phenomenon of water receding was observed as far away as Hawaii and Japan. Aftershocks continued to tremble the ground, and a tsunami warning was issued. By the time the tsunami reached the coast, its power had significantly diminished. However, it was still strong enough to sweep through the city. A massive wall of water surged over the coastline and into the city. Wah! Help me! No matter how hard people ran, they could not outrun the tsunami. The only way to survive was to get to higher ground or to the tops of buildings. The enormous mass of water overwhelmed the buildings that had barely withstood the earthquake. San Francisco was completely submerged and surrounding coastal cities were also inundated. Debris from destroyed buildings, trash and corpses floated on the surface. Survivors wearing life jackets were swept along the water, shouting for help. Ronald was known for his autocratic personality. Whether in real estate, on TV shows or now as president, he pushed his ideas unilaterally without persuading or compromising with those around him. This made collaboration with the Democratic-controlled Congress impossible, And his term continued to be chaotic. CNN and NBC mocked Ronald as a dictator. Yet this style was proving very helpful now. In a crisis, a strong leader who can issue commands quickly based on changing situations is essential. News of aftershocks and tsunamis following the big one came immediately. I was speechless seeing the tsunami sweep through the city. Ronald and his advisors were equally stunned. I recalled the tsunami damage from the 2004 South Asian earthquake and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. However, this was worse than the two combined. Satellite images soon arrived. The tsunami had reshaped the coastline of the U.S. West Coast. San Francisco was completely submerged and the San Francisco Bay was now connected to the sea. Water would naturally recede over time, but the immediate problem was critical. Rescue measures were quickly implemented. Every vessel owned by the government, including the Navy, Coast Guard and maritime rescue teams, was mobilized for rescue. However, this was grossly inadequate. Private vessels had been requisitioned before the disaster, but not forcibly. Instead, voluntary participation was chosen, conditional on property tax exemptions. For this purpose, wireless and GPS equipment purchased from Seosung Electronics was equipped similarly to helicopters. However, to conduct rescues, boats must directly navigate into the danger zones. How many of them would actually move? Ronald appealed through broadcasts. Now is the time for hope, not despair. The U.S. will deploy all its power to save survivors. We will not stop until the end. Everyone, please join together for the rescue. The government had distributed life jackets to every household before the disaster struck. Because of this, many people floated on the water wearing jackets. Among them, some had already become corpses. The chances of survival after being swept away by a tsunami are slim. Those who managed to take refuge in tall buildings and fell in after they were filled with water survived. Ross clung to the submerged wreckage to avoid being swept away by the current. His young daughter was clinging to him. She whimpered, "Dad, I'm scared." He spat out the seawater that entered his mouth and replied, "Just hang on a little longer, Vanessa. Where's Mom?" "Mom evacuated first, so we just need to get away now. Help will be here soon." It was a lie. The disaster had struck while his wife was briefly outside, and he had no idea of her fate. He had simply escaped the collapsing building with his child. Still, he had managed to grab a life jacket, allowing them to stay alive. I should have evacuated the family first. Regret is always too late, no matter how fast it comes. Crying and screams echoed everywhere. Only endless despair filled the air. There was no sign of hope for rescue. Then suddenly, a motor sound began to be heard from somewhere. Looking up, he saw a fishing boat approaching rapidly. People shouted toward the boat. "Over here. Help us." Ross also shouted at the top of his lungs, "There's a child. Please let her on first." But the captain of the boat shook his head and replied, "There is plenty of room, so no need to rush. Look behind you." People turned their heads in unison. Following the ship, a dozen more vessels were approaching. And far out at sea, an endless line of boats was visible. From old fishing boats to luxurious yachts owned by enthusiasts, all were making their way toward San Francisco. Despite the risks of aftershocks and building collapses, hundreds of civilian ships rushed to save survivors. An elderly man in his 80s, piloting a luxury yacht, took a sip of bourbon and muttered, "Still, I'm doing something meaningful for my country before I die." They threw life vests toward the survivors. Those who got on the boats first pulled up people still in the water. The yacht, heavily loaded with survivors almost up to its deck, maneuvered away. Other boats followed, picking up more survivors. In the sky, helicopters continuously flew around, rescuing those on building rooftops. It felt as if the sea was filled with boats and the sky with helicopters. Human strength cannot prevent natural disasters. However, humans can overcome them. Journalists pressed their camera shutters repeatedly, captivated by the majestic sight unlike anything they'd ever seen. A reporter from the BBC, witnessing the scene, shouted in excitement, "Right now in San Francisco, operations like the Berlin airlift and the Dunkirk evacuation are taking place simultaneously." The cruise ships scheduled to depart were included in the government's requisition list, remaining on standby in nearby waters, giving up their commercial operations. Tsunamis exhibit powerful effects closer to the shore than in the open sea. Therefore, the vessels that were far from the coast did not suffer significant damage. After the tsunami passed, the cruises quickly headed towards San Francisco. Thousands of passenger cruise ships served as excellent maritime shelters. Boats loaded with survivors began arriving at the cruises one by one. Staff distributed pre-prepared blankets and warm tea, guiding survivors to rooms for classification. Injured individuals were treated by doctors who had already been on board the cruises, while those needing major surgeries were airlifted to nearby hospitals using helicopters available on the cruises. Great powers unite more strongly in times of crisis. In the face of an unprecedented national disaster, Americans thought about what they could do for their country. Endless evacuees flocked to the shelters, while hospitals were overwhelmed with injured patients. Due to a shortage of operating rooms, simple surgeries and emergency care were conducted even in hallways and patient rooms. Retired doctors and nurses rolled up their sleeves to join the effort, while long lines of people waiting to donate blood formed outside hospitals. Volunteers also flocked to the shelters with so many applicants that some had to be turned away. The worst crisis in American history became an opportunity to demonstrate the resilience of the United States to the world. Rescue measures function like interlocking gears. In such a large-scale disaster, finding a precedent for such organized and efficient response is nearly impossible. This was possible because they had foreseen and prepared for the disaster. Kiran Mohan accurately predicted the scale and timing of the big one. Kong Jin-ho communicated this to the public and persuaded the administration, and Ronald Stamper issued the necessary directives based on that information. If it hadn't been for these three, the United States would have suffered an irreparable blow. All three played significant roles, but the most crucial was undoubtedly Kong Jin-ho. Professor Mohan is a seismologist and Ronald is the President of the United States. They were simply fulfilling their respective roles. But Kong Jin-ho is different. He is an investor unrelated to the earthquake and a Korean, not even an American. Yet despite facing criticism, mockery, contempt and threats from all sides, he risked everything to alert people to the dangers of the big one. That action saved countless lives. If someone like him isn't a hero, then who can be called a hero? Meanwhile, the media, which had been hurling criticisms at Kong Jin-ho, collectively shifted their stance and began publishing praise articles. Time magazine apologized for comparing Kong Jin-ho to Rasputin, and other media outlets also acknowledged their mistakes and offered apologies. Until just a day before Big One broke out, Kong Jin-ho was seen as the culprit who ruined America. The anger of Americans was directed squarely at Koreans, and they couldn't even go out properly. In Korean communities and schools with many Korean international students, warnings were issued, and travelers were cautious not to reveal their Korean identity. However, after the big one erupted, the situation changed 180 degrees. Kong Jin-ho became an instant hero who saved America from crisis. All Americans felt sorry and grateful towards Kong Jin-ho. Naturally, the treatment of Koreans also changed. A young Korean couple boarded a flight from Paris to Atlanta. While sitting in economy class and waiting for takeoff, the flight attendant asked, "Are there any Korean passengers?" Feeling curious, they raised their hands and the attendant said, "The passengers in first class would like to change seats." "What?" Confused, the elderly American couple from first class approached them and said, "Thanks to Kong Jin-ho, our kids and grandson are safe. We want to express our gratitude this way." "Oh no. We didn't do anything." As they continued to decline, other American passengers stood up and urged them to go to first class. The Korean couple, who had been saving money for their world trip, unexpectedly found themselves in first class for the first time in their lives. A similar situation occurred at hotels. "Excuse us? We reserved a standard room. Why are we getting a deluxe ocean view?" American Airlines announced that they would upgrade Korean passengers to business class when there were available seats, and famous hotel chains like Hilton and Marriott announced that they would upgrade Koreans' rooms to deluxe for free. Once this information spread, Americans flocked to the bulletin boards to voice their complaints. "Fill first class with Koreans. What's the point of leaving empty seats? Is a deluxe upgrade all we get? At least upgrade us to a suite." Other businesses followed suit. Restaurants and bars offered half-price discounts to Koreans, and some places even displayed signs saying, "Free for Koreans." At tourist sites, entrance fees were waived for Koreans, and local residents cheered and applauded. Americans openly expressed their fondness for Korea, shouting, "I love Korea." With such a warm welcome everywhere, those who were shy had to hide their Korean identity. In contrast, Japanese and Chinese people pretended to be Korean. A Korean community member was taken aback when they saw their Japanese neighbor, who proudly wore an Rising Sun flag t-shirt just days before, suddenly wearing a Taeguki t-shirt. Upon arriving in California, Ronald set up headquarters in a shelter near Stockton. His staff warned him it was dangerous, but he didn't listen. Ronald commanded the situation like a battlefield commander. Despite being in his 70s, he exhibited incredible stamina. In contrast, I felt like I would collapse at any moment. I hadn't slept properly since a few days before Big One's arrival, and that continued even after it struck. There was hardly a moment to catch my breath. Every time an aftershock hit, the shelter shook and my colleagues turned pale. However, Ronald didn't flinch. It was clear he wasn't an ordinary person. More and more disaster victims crowded the shelter. Despite stockpiling supplies, everything felt inadequate. Yet America's tremendous production capacity shone through here as well. Immediately, businesses in nearby states responded to the government's orders, producing and transporting relief supplies and swiftly restoring damaged power and roads. Relief supplies and rescue personnel from around the world were arriving by airplane. The key was to send them to the right places at the right times. In some developing countries, relief supplies sit unused in warehouses, never distributed on time. The disaster response headquarters began checking the number of people and necessary supplies at each shelter to ensure adequate distribution. Meanwhile, the media, which had been critical of Ronald, restrained sensational reporting and focused on rescue facts. Each day, miraculous survival stories adorned the news. Some were rescued after being buried under debris because their Samsung smartphone automatically sent their location, and others, swept away by a tsunami, were saved by private vessels patrolling designated zones. Families who thought they had lost loved ones in the shelter embraced each other, tears flowing. I smiled at the sight. While taking a brief break, Ronald approached and placed his hand on my shoulder, saying, "What are you doing?" "There's a meeting, so let's go." "Ah, yes. You look really tired." "Oh no, I'm not. The truth is, I feel like I'm going to die from exhaustion. Please send me back to Korea." Ronald slapped my back hard with his palm and said, "A young guy like you can't be this weak. Get it together." "Yes. You have way too much energy." Once again, I was dragged along by Ronald's hand without a moment to rest. The U.S. stock market was suspended for a week. Surprisingly, the shock to the financial markets was not as severe compared to the impact of the big one. Ironically, prior chaos had already caused substantial drops. Additionally, the U.S. government quickly responded, instilling confidence in recovery and reconstruction efforts. The main reason, however, was that advanced preparations had been made. Silicon Valley is home to headquarters and research labs of major companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook, all within the top 10 by market capitalization in the U.S. Had these companies suffered irreversible damage, the market would have experienced shocks greater than a financial crisis. Fortunately, just before the big one struck, IT companies concentrated in Silicon Valley evacuated personnel and critical equipment. Despite the collapse of numerous headquarters and labs, top market cap companies showcased their resilience. Google's search engine, Facebook's social media, and Amazon's online shopping platform operated without issues, and Apple and Microsoft proceeded with scheduled software updates. CEOs collectively mourned the victims and assured that their fundamentals were intact. Of course, some companies were affected. In particular, Tesla managed to evacuate personnel safely, but its factory near Silicon Valley halted operations entirely due to damage to the production line. When the U.S. stock market reopened a week later, top-cap stocks surged, seemingly to recover their previous losses. The three major U.S. indexes, the Dow Jones, DJIA, NASDAQ, and S&P, with tongue sticking out 500, recorded increases close to 3%. Large-scale recovery efforts are expected following the earthquake, leading to skyrocketing construction and infrastructure-related stocks. While safe haven assets declined, commodity prices and the dollar continued to soar. Big One dealt a significant blow to domestic companies as well. However, Samsung Group was among the least affected. When Kang Jin-Hu came to order batteries and GPS in preparation for Big One, it seemed crazy at the time. How else could they have suggested consulting a psychiatrist? But as OTK companies' subsidiaries began pulling out of Silicon Valley, their perspective shifted somewhat. Im Jin-young held Kang Jin-hoo in very high regard. The choice of Keros as a partner for Samsung Group was partly due to this respect. Thus they decided to give faith one more try. A CEO should not entrust a company's fate to uncertain endeavors. Therefore they opted for collaboration only within safe limits to avoid significant losses. They first planned to relocate the staff and equipment of their Silicon Valley research facilities to elsewhere and established contingency plans in case of emergencies. The U.S. government demanded that manufacturers force an app update on smartphones located in danger zones for rescue purposes. Samsung Electronics was the only company to comply with this demand. It wasn't without risks. After deciding to follow the policy, a boycott erupted in the U.S. and sales saw a slight decline. Nevertheless, they pressed on, knowing that if Big One did not occur, losses would be minimal, while the potential gains from its occurrence would be enormous. And then it actually happened. As soon as Big One unfolded, Samsung Electronics smartphones automatically transmitted rescue requests and various information to the Disaster Command Center. Thanks to this, the proportion of Samsung Electronics smartphone users among those rescued was overwhelmingly high. The survivors expressed immense gratitude to Samsung Electronics. Apple and Google announced belatedly that they would force an update in accordance with government policy following the incident, but public reaction was frosty. Criticism poured in asking why they hadn't done it sooner if it was possible. Moreover, it contradicted their previous statement claiming, the government must not invade individual privacy under any circumstances. While Apple and Samsung Electronics are seen as the two dominant players in the premium smartphone market, most believe Samsung Electronics is inferior to Apple. Even though Samsung Electronics had higher sales, Apple's operating profit margins were overwhelmingly superior due to its premium image leading to much higher sales prices. While technology may be surpassed, it's not easy to surpass an image. However, the current situation presents a golden opportunity to elevate Samsung Electronics' image to the highest level. All the GPS and wireless communication equipment used in the structure are Samsung Electronics products, and the other electronic devices in the shelter are the same. Samsung Electronics products play a significant role in overcoming this disaster. Chairman Lim Jin-young said to Director Kim Myung-s, "Consult with OTK company and say that we won't be accepting payment for products made from now on." What if? Let's consider it a donation. When thinking about what can be gained in the future, several hundred billion won in product payments is nothing. Please load the produced items onto the dedicated aircraft. Even though the research institute has been moved, there are numerous Samsung Electronics directly operated stores in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there are hundreds of employees from the U.S. corporation working there. Most have reportedly evacuated safely or been rescued, but as the group chairman he needed to show a sense of responsibility. Chairman Lim Jin-young stood up. "I will go to California immediately and meet with Kang Jin-hoo. The U.S. military stationed in South Korea is on high alert. Soldiers on leave have all returned to their units, and outings and overnight stays are prohibited. With a crisis unfolding in the U.S., it's uncertain what North Korea might do. The South Korean military and the U.S. forces have heightened their vigilance, closely monitoring North Korea's actions. However, North Korea remained surprisingly quiet. Just yesterday they referred to Ronald as an insane old man, making threats about launching ICBMs carrying nuclear warheads to the U.S. mainland. But once the major earthquake occurred, they swiftly changed their approach and released a statement. Our supreme dignity has expressed heartfelt condolences regarding the disaster in the United States. Furthermore, if necessary, our republic is willing to assist in improving North American relations. Upon reflection, this response makes sense. An injured beast should not be provoked. Provocation towards the U.S. is only feasible when the U.S. can retaliate. Conducting provocations under the current circumstances would be suicidal. Other countries have displayed similar restraint. Russia cancelled its scheduled airstrikes in Syria, and China has also halted mentions related to trade disputes, opting instead to issue a condolence statement. European nations, which had been at odds over NATO and the Paris Climate Agreement, issued condolence statements and promised various forms of support. Memorial rallies were held across the United States. Citizens gathered voluntarily in Times Square, Manhattan, holding candles and American flags. Those attending the rally honored the victims, cheered on the rescue efforts and expressed gratitude to Kang Jin-ho. Both the American flag and the South Korean flag waved at the rally. Times Square is famous for having the highest advertising expenses worldwide. Building owners willingly gave up advertising fees, displaying large American and South Korean flags on the electronic billboards. The wave of American and South Korean flags filling Times Square even surprised Korean netizens. In fact, it's not unusual for Koreans to see both flags waving together at rallies, as they often witness this at conservative group protests. The difference is that this location is Times Square, not Gwangwon Plaza or City Hall Plaza, and the people gathering were Americans. Could the Parents Association really be protesting all the way in America? This isn't a far-right group rally. Don't misunderstand. Who would have thought we'd see American and South Korean flags waving together in the heart of New York? It's true that Kang Jin-ho carried this hard. Despite facing all sorts of criticism, he persistently pushed through and finally succeeded. This is what real patriotism looks like. Watching this brings tears to my eyes. By the way, all the conservative groups in front of OTK company disappeared after the big one. What's going to happen to the Parents Association now? Shouldn't we be more worried about our leader than them? Our leader has become the enemy again. Chief Kim Song-cheol jolted upright in surprise. What did you say? Who came to visit? That's Ambassador Thomas Young from the US has come to see you. Are you joking right now? The subordinate officer spoke with a flustered tone. And no, it's not a joke. He's right downstairs. He knows the ambassador must be extremely busy due to the disaster that occurred in the US. But why is he here, not at the Blue House? Chief Kim looked out the window. He could see foreign correspondents gathering at the entrance. By now, the fact that the ambassador personally came to meet the head of the Korean police must be known externally. I'll let him in. Ambassador Thomas Young entered the room. There's a hierarchy in diplomacy. The fact that the ambassador skipped straight to the police chief without going through the Blue House could easily be seen as meddling in internal affairs. The US side surely knew this. Still, there must be a significant reason behind this action. Ambassador Thomas Young, a Korean American, was fluent in Korean. As soon as he sat down, he got straight to the point. I am aware that there has been extreme personal attacks, defamation and illegal activities targeting Kang Jin-ho. Why is the Korean police taking no action? Could this be the reason for his visit? Chief Kim cautiously responded, "We will investigate if we deem it necessary." Ambassador Thomas Young replied firmly, "He is a hero in America." Chief Kim silently screamed inside, "Since when has this been the case?" Even when the US was in chaos, preparing for the uncertain arrival of Big One, he understood that Thomas, the US ambassador, had considerable dissatisfaction. But now this, of course, the situation then and now is very different. Ambassador Thomas stood up as if he had said everything he needed to say. Keep this in mind. The White House is closely monitoring the current situation. After that statement, Thomas left. Alone, Chief Kim Song-cheol of the National Police Agency fell into deep thought. Until now, the police had conducted investigations thoroughly based on the regime's preferences, just like the prosecution. Protests by progressive groups were forcefully suppressed, even mobilizing water cannons, while demonstrations by conservative groups were overlooked. The company's numerous illegal activities were ignored, while collective actions by unions were labeled as illegal strikes and dismantled. The decision not to investigate various illegal acts by OTK company was also due to directives from above. If the truth comes to light, it won't be a simple matter of resigning. There's a risk of being imprisoned for abuse of authority. He would become a criminal in custody wearing prison clothes, rising to the highest ranks of the police. Thinking this made cold sweat run down his back. Now is not the time to be wary of the Blue House or the ruling party. Once Kang Jin-ho returns, everything will come to an end. Chief Kim Song-cheol ordered all police to act immediately. Arrest every single one of those conservative groups that have held illegal protests and the media liars who wrote false articles. The original Parents Union was merely one of many conservative groups that were proliferating. However, after Park Si-hyung's election as governor of Gyeonggi Province, it rapidly grew, now boasting more than 3,000 regular members. Furthermore, It became a massive organization capable of mobilizing tens of thousands for a single protest. They claimed to uphold the banner of eradicating pro-North leftists and protecting free South Korea, but in reality, it was more akin to Park Si-hyung's loyalist group. They proudly displayed their affiliation with pro-Park organizations without hiding it. At first glance, there seemed to be no major issues. The problem lies in their actions. Whenever anyone displayed even slight criticism of the government, they would descend en masse to protest. They targeted not only civic and labor organizations but also legislators and media outlets. Illegal protests were commonplace, along with business interference, property damage, insults and threats, and even acts of violence. It resembled the Red Guards during the Mao Zedong era. If other civic organizations had acted this way, relevant individuals would have been arrested by now, and their leadership would be dismantled. However, the police and media openly turned a blind eye to the parents' union's actions, leading to increasingly radical protests. To stage large-scale demonstrations, substantial financial resources are required. While participants may gather voluntarily, funds are necessary for protest materials, banners, and other supplies. Moreover, the parents' union has chartered buses to transport members not only from the metropolitan area but from across the nation for demonstrations. Their protests have taken them everywhere, wherever pro-government rallies were needed. The expenses must be considerable, raising questions about where the money comes from. In response to a journalist's inquiry about funding sources, Chairman Lee Yong-kwang confidently stated, "We operate on donations collected from elderly people who gather scraps." Yet even as scrap prices continue to hit record lows, the parents' union's funds show no signs of drying up. On the third floor of a large building near Jongno Tapgal Park, renting in the city center is quite expensive, yet the parents' union occupied an entire floor as their office. A few days ago, the conservative groups were fiercely protesting in front of the OTK company headquarters. However, after Big One's arrival, the protests abruptly stopped, and the executive team gathered in the office to enjoy a rare moment of relaxation. Chairman Lee Yong-kwang made calls to the president of the National Veterans Association and the head of the Mother's Army. Suspend the protests until further notice and ensure strict internal monitoring. The elderly members of the executive sat on the sofa, sipping mixed coffee while watching the news. The TV screen displayed the devastated scenery of San Francisco. Seeing the scene, the Secretary General gasped. "Wow, I can't believe a major earthquake actually happened." An elder cautiously replied, "Then isn't it the aftermath that helped America?" Another elder retorted angrily, "What are you talking about? This is all thanks to President Ronald. What did that guy even do?" Still, they hailed him as a hero in America. "That's nonsense. Americans are being deceived without knowing the truth. That guy is very bad. Right? Isn't he a pro-North Korea communist?" While they were talking, suddenly the office door opened and police officers entered. "What are the police doing here?" Chairman Lee Yong-kwang, though surprised, greeted them cheerfully. "Oh dear, you must be having a hard time today too. So what brings you here?" But the answer he heard was unexpected. "This is an arrest warrant. You have the right to remain silent, and any statement may be used against you in court. You have the right to appoint an attorney and can allow your attorney to speak on your behalf when questioned. If you do not appoint an attorney, a public defender will be assigned to you." "Huh. What is this, a bolt from the blue?" Lee Yong-kwang said to the approaching police officers attempting to arrest him. "Wow, we're on the same side." At those words, the police momentarily halted and he smiled. "Why act surprised? We're from a pro-park organization. Seems like you've come to the wrong place." The officer who ordered the arrest said, bewildered, "You like being on the same side? Arrest them all." The elderly inside the office were all seized by the police. They shouted in dismay. "Who do you think you are, you inconsiderate fools? How dare you, you punks barely out of your teenage years? What did we do wrong anyway? We were just protesting to protect a free Republic of Korea." When waving the taegukgi and the U.S. flag during protests, they were fearless, but alone they were just powerless old men. Meanwhile, public authority had thoroughly supported them. The police actually aided the protests. But suddenly they turned their blades like this. Chairman Lee Yong-kwang shouted as he was dragged away in handcuffs. "You guys are making a mistake. Do you even know who's behind me? Do you think you can get away with this? The police arrested not only the Parents' Federation but also the executives of groups such as the Park Supporters, the Mom Volunteer Corps and the National Salvation Military Association. Meanwhile, summons were issued for journalists from newspapers and broadcasters alike. Conservative media outlets eagerly wrote articles during this time. They went beyond simple criticism or condemnation, frequently resorting to personal attacks and fabricating stories. OTK Company Equity Deposit. Is there really any truth? Most assets have already been siphoned off to secret Swiss accounts. Made $1 trillion through financial speculation exploiting the chaos. Testimonies claim 200 tons of gold bars are hidden in a secret safe under the house. Shocking truth reported by defector groups. Is it possible they conspired with North Korea to destabilize the U.S. after the earthquake? Presumed to have secretly contacted North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho during his trip to the U.S. after the earthquake. After the earthquake, it was revealed that Kang Jin-hoo and Kang Kol-young, a high-ranking member of North Korea, share the same last name. Notably, the allegations of sexual favors and prostitution which fed into each other were outrageous. Kang Jin-hoo received sexual favors from porn stars every time he traveled to the U.S. Engaged in sexual acts with numerous porn stars in a secret room. Paid $100,000 for each encounter. Must clarify position on prostitution. Minister of Gender Equality Cho Yoo-seon calls for harsh punishment. Interpol should cooperate to arrest him in the U.S. Many citizens support the detention investigation of Kang Jin-hoo. When I checked the source, it turned out to be Daily World News. Domestic media had copied and reproduced articles that were considered tabloid within the U.S. Of course, this wasn't the first time this happened. There had been similar instances where the factual checking was neglected or mistranslations were used. However, this situation was overly evident in its intent, making it hard to consider it just a continuation of past events. Both Faceit and OTK Company denied the claims, but no counter-articles were published. The article inflated suspicions, conservative groups stepped in to accuse, then public authority moved to investigate. This was a typical pattern frequently used by the current government. Reporters were summoned to police stations one after another to write statements. Some media outlets recognized the seriousness of the situation and promised to apologize and prevent recurrence. But the conservative newspapers and the three major broadcasters, centered around the Jungilbo, banded together to issue a statement of condemnation. The government must immediately stop media suppression. Guarantee the public's right to know. We will fight to the end for the truth. However, public reaction was cold. It was nice when you were spreading false facts disguised as articles. Those reporters must be severely punished. Look at the audacity to spread false information and then scream media suppression. Let's take this opportunity to eradicate those reporters. While reporters are an issue, aren't extreme right-wing sites a problem too? If you look at what they've posted online, it's serious. They even dragged in families. If Kang Jin-hoo had seen it, he would have collapsed holding his neck. They're all deleting their posts now. The OTK Company already captured everything and is filing lawsuits. We should clean up everything this time. Well, they've become the villains too. Park Sang-yeop visited the police station directly. He wasn't alone. Dozens of foreign journalists followed behind him. Previously, Park Sang-yeop had been assaulted while trying to rescue Young Jae-hong from protesters. He had quite a solid build, so he was almost fully recovered, but he wrapped bandages around the injured areas on purpose and limped a bit. The police, seeing Park Sang-yeop and the foreign journalists, looked flustered and asked, "What brings you here?" "I've come to submit a complaint." "Oh yes. Please go ahead." Park Sang-yeop placed the entire box he was holding on the counter. The police, increasingly bewildered, asked, Is this all the complaints?" "No." "Then?" Soon after, staff members began pouring in, each carrying boxes. "How many people are you suing?" Park Sang-yeop told the bewildered police, "Illegal protests, assault, spreading false information, defamation, insults and so on. I will sue them all." The posts about Kang Jin-hoo on extreme right-wing sites were unbearable to read. While he could tolerate some degree of criticism and insults, many went beyond that. Combining pornographic images with Kang Jin-hoo's face was among the milder offenses. They even dragged in family members. They claimed Kang Jin-hoo was an illegitimate child, that his deceased father was a spy, and that his mother was visiting host bars, spending millions of won a day from her son's money. One person even took a photo of a middle-aged woman entering a motel with a young man and captioned it Kang Jin-hoo's mom. Another online media outlet even used that as a news article. If Kang Jin-hoo had seen it himself, he would have been furious. The more provocative posts were made, the more responses and recommendations increased. No one felt the need for sanctions or raised awareness. However, after the Big One incident, the atmosphere changed drastically. Many who sensed the shift quickly deleted their posts and went into hiding. But by then, everything had already been captured. Even if he filed a lawsuit, it seemed like there wouldn't be a proper investigation, so he was just waiting for the right timing. Park Sang-yeep smiled and said, "Looking at the IDs and IPs, some seem to be identified as National Intelligence Service employees or government officials. Please conduct a thorough investigation and punish them according to the law." I talked to my mother for the first time in a while. "Are you home?" "Of course. It's obvious I'd be home at this time." Due to protests by conservative groups not only in front of the company but also locating and demonstrating at our home in Dongtan, my mother had to move her residence hurriedly. For a while she stayed secretly at the Ceylon Hotel. While at the Ceylon Hotel, So Im Sumi helped her out in various ways, so I thought I should visit later and express my gratitude. After the Big One incident, the conservative groups disappeared, and my mother safely returned to our Dongtan home. Still, just in case, she increased the number of bodyguards. I'm also curious about how they found out about the Dongtan house. Unless someone tipped them off. Your name came up earlier. It feels like you and President Ronald are the only ones on TV these days. CNN and several media outlets wanted to interview me. I asked with a smile, "Are you going to do it? What's the point of me doing an interview? Anyway, I'm proud that you saved so many people more than the money you made. My son is the best." Hearing my mother's voice made my nose feel a bit tingly. "When are you coming back to Korea?" "I'll be back soon." In fact, my role had practically ended with the emergence of the Big One. It wouldn't be a problem if I went back to Korea, leaving the aftermath to others. However, Ronald seemed to keep me by his side like an external consultant. The main news always featured us together. "Always take care of yourself. You know health is the most important, right?" "Yes, I understand." After finishing the call with my mother, I called Take-You to check on the company situation. These days the police are working really hard. They're arresting the fake news journalists and conducting raids on far-right site servers. We receive dozens of letters at the company every day, most of which are tearful pleas for forgiveness. "Really?" Take-You replied excitedly. "I go to work every day, read through them carefully and write personal replies saying, 'No. I won't drop the charges. I have no intention of doing so. Go back quickly.'" "Is there a reason for doing that?" "Yeah. I have to teach them that life is reality." Professor Mohan warned that if the Big One struck, it could result in the deaths of 1 million people. People scoffed, dismissing it as nonsense. However, when the Big One actually hit, it became clear how misguided that skepticism had been. Had preparations not been made, it would not have been surprising if 2 million had died. Conversely, despite those preparations, the combined number of dead and missing reached 70,000. Efforts to rescue survivors and recover bodies were ongoing, yet the death toll continued to rise. San Francisco was completely devastated. The only consolation was that the southern part of Silicon Valley, along with Fremont and Oakland, suffered less damage. Despite this being the worst disaster in history, the United States still showcased its resilience. The government and businesses continued to operate as normal, with the financial and industrial systems functioning without issue. In fact, compared to the chaos before the Big One, things seem to be running more smoothly now. Ronald lived in a shelter with his aides, sharing meals and sleeping alongside the displaced individuals. Most external schedules were delegated to the cabinet, allowing him to focus entirely on coordinating rescue efforts. He also held daily press briefings to keep the public updated on the situation. American media actively participated in this effort. While it might be seen as a show, it was enough to create the impression that the president was with the people. Just before the impeachment crisis, Ronald's approval rating had plummeted to a historic low of 5%, an outcome often attributed to misdialed phone calls. However, a recent opinion poll reported a staggering 92% approval rating. When asked about the effectiveness of their preparations for the big one, 97% responded positively. Such approval ratings were more typical of a dictatorship. After all, if not for Ronald, who else could have made such decisive choices? Following the disaster, the scandals, both Russian and sexual, that had plagued his administration since the start faded into oblivion. In the current climate, no one could afford to attack Ronald. Those who had participated in the impeachment now pleaded tearfully for forgiveness, promising to support both crisis management and future governance, regardless of party lines. Yet some could not escape accountability. Those who led the impeachment, Governor Simon Underwood and Vice President Bauer, as well as Governor Martin Albright, who had shifted the blame for the Bluebell fire disaster onto Ronald, could be considered politically finished. The shelters were overflowing with the influx of evacuees. The United States showcased its immense technological prowess and staggering production capacity to the world during the last two world wars. American companies mobilized their technical skills and production capabilities to build large-scale temporary housing in Nevada, adjacent to California's state border. Countless modular homes sprang up in the barren landscape. The evacuees will have to live there for years until the city is rebuilt. The U.S. government officially began fundraising. The amount exceeded $10 billion in just a few days. Every country drained their treasury to contribute, and corporations donated anywhere from millions to billions of dollars. People worldwide willingly participated in donations, hoping for the recovery of the U.S. In addition, relief supplies and firefighters from various countries arrived in California one after the other. Allied nations even considered dispatching military forces. Unlike other presidents who might have declined some help for appearance's sake, Ronald didn't. He encouraged even more support. America needs more assistance. Think of what the U.S. has done for the world over the years. It's time to give back. This wasn't about reclaiming past generosity with a single funeral expense. The U.S., as the world's wealthiest nation, also provided the most foreign aid. Nonetheless, the need for support was genuine. While recovery could wait, rescue was urgent. Due to the vast extent of the disaster, even the military struggled with manpower shortages. Troops from allied nations steadily arrived in California and were seamlessly integrated under the command of the U.S. military for rescue operations. South Korea sent the second-largest contingent after the U.K. Perhaps it was due to the blood alliance with the U.S., but they probably intend to offer manpower instead of money. There are plenty of soldiers in Korea who can be employed for a tenth of minimum wage. A few years ago I was one of them. I looked at Chairman Im Jin-young, who was sitting next to me. He flew to California as soon as the incident occurred, overseeing the employees of the American corporation and checking the company's situation. He met with Ronald and expressed that Samsung Group would cooperate as much as possible, both now and in the future. In this major earthquake, Samsung Electronics played an enormous role. Most of the equipment used for rescue and the electronic devices in the shelters are Samsung products. Most importantly, by immediately transmitting the information of smartphone users in the disaster areas to the integrated disaster headquarters, countless lives were saved. Thanks to this, Samsung's recognition within the United States has significantly increased. I thought I would just meet Ronald and return, but Chairman Im Jin-young has been staying here for several days helping volunteers. Are you not tired? I'm fine. Even though he said that, he looked quite exhausted. The position of the chairman doesn't usually involve physical labor. Chairman Im Jin-young wiped his sweat and said, "I knew it, but it's still America. No matter how prepared you are, to proceed with rescue and recovery so quickly is impressive. If a similar earthquake occurred in China, it would probably have resulted in over 1 million casualties." Indeed, during the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, the Chinese government initially showed confusion, resulting in damage that included a death toll and missing persons of over 100,000. This is America's strength. It's not just a hegemon for nothing. Chairman Im Jin-young smiled. It's a great relief that companies in Silicon Valley are unscathed. Apple and Google are Samsung's competitors as well as collaborators. If the IT industry had collapsed, the semiconductor demand would have drastically decreased, severely impacting Samsung as well. The earthquake will bring about many changes. The fate of companies will hinge on how they respond moving forward. I nodded. Everyone seems to be moving busily. Companies began preparing for the aftermath of the earthquake. Ronald declared from the beginning of his presidency that he would create jobs for American workers. To achieve this, he erected trade barriers and offered tax incentives to companies building factories in the U.S. Indeed, there were results in reshoring, where factories of American companies that had gone abroad returned home. However, the increase in jobs was not as expected. This was inevitable, as no amount of benefits could close the wage gap between American workers and their counterparts in Vietnam or Cambodia. Originally, reshoring was possible because advancements in robotics and automation allowed a reduction in the number of workers. However, the San Francisco earthquake resolved the unemployment issue overnight. There was chaos everywhere as people rushed to produce relief supplies and engage in construction and recovery. Experts predicted that due to the earthquake's special circumstances, there would be an economic boom for the next few years. There were prospects of changes in industrial structure and economic landscape. The crucial question is who will benefit from this. From a national perspective, obviously the U.S. is the top priority, followed by China. However, the U.S. would not relinquish a leading role to China, which has rapidly ascended as a G2 power. Japan, as an ally of the U.S. with capital and technology, faced issues due to yen appreciation driven by a preference for safe assets, naturally falling behind in price competitiveness. In contrast, South Korea possessed technology and sufficient price competitiveness due to the collapse of the won's value. Most importantly, the key player post-quake is Korean. OTK Company, while a U.S. entity, is headquartered in South Korea. Considering its contributions, OTK Company was highly likely to possess the keys to the future recovery industry. Korean companies uniformly attempted to contact OTK Company. However, Representative Kong Jin, who remained in the U.S., while the deputy representative was rarely seen externally. The only accessible person was Park Sang-yeop, Kong Jin-hoo's right-hand man and the representative of K Company. Yet even that was not easy. Park Sang-yeop was acutely aware of his position. Therefore, he was unwilling to meet anyone and awaited Kong Jin-hoo's return. As the structure and recovery progressed smoothly, the financial market also showed a gradual recovery. However, uncertainties persisted everywhere. The first factor is the strong dollar. It is expected that large-scale recovery will take place in the United States, leading to assets that were invested in emerging markets returning to the U.S. At this time, as foreign currencies are sold and dollars are bought, the value of emerging market currencies decreases while the value of the dollar increases, following the principles of supply and demand. This was similar during the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake when the Japanese capital scattered globally returned simultaneously, resulting in a temporary appreciation of the yen. For the time being, the U.S. will act like a black hole, absorbing money from around the world. If the dollar rises excessively, it won't be favorable for the U.S., so there's a good chance they will take some form of action. The second factor is rising oil prices. While gold prices do not directly affect the real economy, crude oil has a direct impact on inflation. Due to the big one, shale companies in the West ceased operations, leading to concerns about supply shortages and prompting a rise in oil prices. Middle Eastern countries, Russia and Venezuela, which have suffered from low oil prices for a long time, seem to welcome this situation. As OPEC showed signs of limiting supply to take advantage of rising oil prices, Ronald threatened to release strategic reserves into the market. The U.S. has stored over 600 million barrels of crude oil in underground caverns in Texas and Louisiana to prepare for wars and supply fluctuations following oil shocks. Once Ronald's statement became known, the previously rising oil prices began to fall sharply, providing relief not just to the U.S., but to all countries reliant on crude oil imports. The third factor is the surge in raw material prices. The OTK Company concentrated on purchasing raw materials before the situation escalated, with a particular focus on steel. Until the incident occurred, there was a global oversupply of steel, leading companies to eagerly sign contracts, thinking they could sell excess inventory. When prices skyrocketed afterward, steel and cement companies that had signed delivery contracts regretted their decisions, but they couldn't cancel the contracts after payment had been made. Naturally, we had no intention of canceling our side of the deal either. This situation also significantly impacted financial companies. Fortunately, large financial institutions had already engaged in risk management due to various chaotic situations prior, so if the event had occurred without preparation, It might have led to a crisis similar to the Lehman Brothers. Thinking about it, the decisive factor for the bankruptcy of Barings Bank, which has a 200-year tradition, was the Great Hanshin earthquake. Although the issue was Nick Leeson's straddle selling. Financial authorities around the world are trying to stabilize the market, yet it was still unavoidable to experience credit crunch and a sharp increase in LIBOR rates. It has been 15 days since the big one occurred. The news of survivors being rescued, which had heated the media for days, has now become infrequent. Still, the rescuers did not stop their efforts to save even one more person. When a woman in her 20s, trapped in a building for 15 days, was rescued, everyone clapped their hands in joy. I was driving around nearby shelters with Ronald. Wherever we went, we were warmly welcomed by the victims. Many Americans held my hand in gratitude and I offered them words of consolation. The U.S. was filled with remembrance and mourning for the victims, as well as hope to rise above the suffering and pain. In the car on the way back, I said to Ronald, "It seems like it's time to head back to Korea."